Welcome to this module on the endocrine system. I think that it is a good idea to start the lecture material of this course by taking a slight step backwards before we fully dive into this system. I believe that so far you all will have covered quite a bit of systems, and let's just consider really quickly as a review the interactions of. So here we see the many systems that make us an organism that functions as all these systems work together. As a side note, quite interestingly, the only system that we can live without is the reproductive system. All others are essential and we absolutely need these. And as I said earlier, if you think about it, somehow all these systems must be coordinated so that they work together. For example, skeletal muscles, which we need to be able to move around and respond to our environment and achieve the things that we want to achieve. Well, these muscles need to attach to bones. Remember the concept of muscles typically running over a joint in order to generate the movement of that joint. So one system here cannot achieve its function without another, right? But then again, to be able to perform their job in this example, which is, to put it very simply, to contract so that the movement can be generated. These skeletal muscles need energy, nutrients, oxygen, and so on. So to enable this, we must have a way to transport these to the skeletal muscle tissues. And for this purpose, we use blood as transportation media. So again, we need this another system to help this particular system to achieve its job. In this case, the cardiovascular system is needed to assist these skeletal muscles. But we must get these nutrients and energy to the blood somehow. Well, for that, we have digestive system, right? Without it, the skeletal system does not get the resources that it needs to function its job. But wait, there's even more. We also need to get oxygen to the skeletal muscles and get rid of carbon dioxide, which is a byproduct of cellular metabolism, where glucose from the food is turned into ATP that drives the muscle's job. So we also need to have respiratory system added to this. But when you exercise, for example, and your muscles work hard, as a byproduct, you will generate heat. And to avoid overheating, your integumentary system steps in. You might, for example, start to sweat in order to reduce the heating and avoid, of course, overheating. So another system linked into this, right? And don't forget that some of the blood may be escaping the cardiovascular system as an interstitial fluid. And as it enters the lymphatic system, it becomes lymph. And of course, we remember that the lymphatic system plays an important role as one of our body defense systems. And looking back to what we already discussed, we remember that as a byproduct of metabolism, we had excess carbon dioxide and water. To make carbonic acid, of course, which is something that we need to deal with, right? And while bicarb is eliminated via respiratory system, we have excess hydrogen now. And we use urinary system to get rid of this hydrogen. So are you starting to see a pattern here? Every system is dependent on another. They are all interlinked. But all this needs to be controlled somehow. And to do this, we have two body control systems. Nervous system, which you learned about at the end of your last A&P course. And we also have endocrine system, which we will be looking into more detail on this chapter. To compare and contrast, let's think of these both just a little bit more. The nervous system is fast in its responses. Remember the quickly progressing action potentials that were the basis of nerve impulses. And the messages in the nervous system last only a short time. Remember, it was all about detecting changes, while otherwise we kind of got used to continuous signals. In comparison, let's have a look at the endocrine system, which we will be focusing on this chapter. It is slower to act. It takes a longer time to achieve its goal via hormones. But the hormones remain in the body for a longer time, so the effects of endocrine system are generally long-lasting. And of course, we have sometimes, or actually quite often, interactions between these two body control systems. Say as an example, epilepsy is a result of uncontrolled firing of action potentials in the brain. And then this spreads from its original location throughout the brain and can often result in seizures. But we can use pharmacological interventions, in other words, drugs. These are essentially acting on the hormonal level. Drugs are used to stop this, or at least to control this uncontrolled firing of action potentials. So we see again that there is a lot of overlap here. And out of these two, we will focus on the endocrine system on this chapter, as I said earlier. The field that studies hormones and their actions, as well as the organs that make and respond to these hormones, is known as endocrinology. I have listed here some important functions of endocrine system. As you can see, it is a large range of things that it covers and affects pretty much everything in the human body, from becoming mature enough to reproduce and playing a role in the reproductive processes such as female menstrual cycle, pregnancy, and giving birth. To growth, remember the growth spurt in the teens is driven by hormones. And then, of course, the maintenance processes. We remember from our earlier studies that all this, maintaining consistent internal environment, is of course known as homeostasis. The reason why I'm highlighting that is that this is so essential for our survival. And of course, we have some other functions to consider too, like cell metabolism. Remember, getting the energy to live. Also, you might remember the term basal metabolic rate as being the amount of energy needed just to maintain essential functions. In other words, energy needed for just being alive without doing any job above that. And we have, of course, also a greater need if we do activities. Finally, I have listed also acting on various things, for example, our protective functions. Let's have a look at the next thing that I wish to remind you briefly about. Say, as part of our introduction to the endocrine system, if you wish, I think it is important that we are clear on the difference between endocrine and exocrine glands. Remember, exocrine glands have a duct of some sort, and the gland opens to outside itself. This may be outside the body, like sweat glands or tear gland or salivary gland, or opening inside the body, like glands responsible of the stomach secretions. So they act really locally. Endocrine glands instead release their secretions to the blood. They do not have a duct like exocrine glands that we saw earlier. And these were, of course, hormones that get secreted here. Some examples that I can think of would be pituitary gland, pineal gland, thyroid gland, adrenal gland, testis, and ovaries. These all act throughout the body. It is important for endocrine glands. Their secretions reach all parts of our body. At this point, I also want to mention pancreas, because it is kind of an interesting one. Which one do you think that it is? Endocrine or exocrine gland? Well, it turns out that it is one of the few glands that serve both as an exocrine and endocrine gland. In a role of an exocrine gland, it produces the most complete digestive juice, which gets released via duct to the first part of the small intestine's duodenum. And as an endocrine gland, it plays an important role in the blood sugar regulation. Here is a great diagram. You will find it with this video in the materials that I have loaded to you to the canvas, if you wish to download or print it for yourself. This picture shows the important endocrine glands all in one view. We will go through all of this. So it is a nice review sheet which you can fill in more detail as you wish. We will be also using it in our review session on Wednesday, so it might be a handy one to have around. So here you can see these endocrine glands labeled. Let's go through each of these very briefly, one by one, as a review. We will then fill in more detail in later videos. Let's start with the important endocrine structures located within the brain. First, pineal gland. It produces melatonin, which of course is responsible for regulating our sleep-wake cycle. Next, we have hypothalamus and pituitary gland, and I have included here a rough diagram showing both of these. Hypothalamus has a large number of functions, but to summarize these, it really is responsible for controlling things. It is often controlled through neural impulses, and its jobs include also controlling pituitary gland. So hypothalamus acts through pituitary. And pituitary gland has a range of functions. For example, it in turn controls adrenal gland, and this was the fight or flight response, and it releases steroid and cortisol. These were stress hormones. It also regulates the growth hormone. This plays an important role, especially in the puberty. I have much more detailed video about the hypothalamic pituitary axis available for you a little later. We also have here thyroid gland. It is important in controlling the metabolic rate. Some clinical considerations arise from when this gland is over or underactive. Next, I want to mention thymus. This plays an important role in the immune system, being the site where T cells are made, hence the name. What is quite interesting about thymus is that when we dissect an adult catheter, we cannot always find it there. This is because it shrinks over age. Remember, I also mentioned that the pituitary gland regulated the adrenal gland. Well, adrenal gland is located on top of the kidney and is responsible for the sympathetic branch, responsible of autonomic nervous system. This is the fight or flight responses. We also have here the kidneys. Let's look at their role as an endocrine gland, albeit just briefly. When we talk about kidneys and the field of medicine that deal with them, we typically talk about renal science. So a kidney doctor is specialized in renal medicine. So what's the most important function of the kidneys? What do you think? Students often say that it is all about being an organ that drives the urination, making urine to be precise. And while this is true, it has perhaps even more important role in filtering blood and regulating blood pressure. This is true renin. And another important hormone that is related to this organ would be the erythropoietin, and controlling red blood cell production in bone marrow. I briefly mentioned pancreas earlier. It was the interesting gland that was both exocrine, producing pancreatic juice, which played a key role in digesting food, and being also endocrine gland. And the role as an endocrine gland is the one that we are interested in this context. It produces insulin, which has all to do with the blood sugar regulation. Okay, the last ones that I want to introduce. These are ovaries and testes. They are responsible for producing sex hormones, so they control, for example, secondary sex characteristics, making reproduction possible as an individual matures, and control menstrual cycle in women. And it is because of this cyclic nature of hormones that menstrual cycle that has some significant effects on the pharmaceutical trials as well. So, in fact, I used to work in the pharmaceutical field and have some good stories to share from that period of my life. Have you ever wondered why it is typically always males who are included in the earliest stages of testing a new drug in humans? Is it because we are so easily replaced? Or just silly enough to sign up to try a new drug while women are smarter? Well, that's not the case exactly. So here is what happens in the development of a new drug. We do lab work, and once we are satisfied with that the new drug will work in theory and based on the lab tests, then it's time for animal experiments. And once we are satisfied with those, then it is time to try the drug on a human. For this stage, we typically always choose males as the test subjects, even if it was a drug mainly aimed for females. Why? Well, it comes to this variation of hormones in females during the menstrual cycle throughout the month. That is why it is easier to start with males, as our hormone levels are typically more stable, so that there are less possible variations to consider at these early stages of pharmacological trial. As the very last thing that I want to mention in this video, I want to remind you of a few terms that you should be familiar with from your earlier Bio 181 or Bio 156 class. These terms are shown here. So chemical messengers of the endocrine system can be either hormones, which travel in blood to all parts of the body. These are the interest of ours in this chapter. Or autocrines, these act on the very cell that's secreted. Or paracrines, which act somewhat locally within a few cells distance. Like I said, these should be familiar terms to you if you have completed your prereq classes. And because autocrines and paracrines are local chemical messengers, they are not technically considered as part of the endocrine system. So we won't spend time on these. So that's it for this video of endocrine system. I hope that it has gotten you interested to learn more as we move further to study this topic in more detail. I will see you in the coming lecture videos for this. For now, thanks for having joined me on this introductory video.